cops knew who I was. I left prints everywhere, and they covered it up and let me kill the rest of those guys to turn me into a serial killer.
I sentence you to death for the murder of Charles Humphreys.
Yeah, your wife and kids get
I sentence you to death for the murder of David Spears.
You sabotaged my ass society. A raped woman got executed and was used for books and movies and shit. Bladder climbs, the election, everything else. You're an inhumane bunch of fucking living bastards and bitches, and you're gonna get your asses nuked in the end.
On the highways of Florida in the late 1980s, truckers and travelers whispered warnings of a mysterious woman funning rides. She wasn't just another drifter. She was something far darker. Aileen Wuornos, one of the few female serial killers in American history. A woman whose story became a twisted cocktail of abuse, survival, murder, and madness. She claimed she killed in self-defense, but juries, judges, and the world saw her as something else entirely. A predator who gunned down her victims, one by one. Wuornos was born in 1956, and from the very beginning, her life was drenched in tragedy. Her father was a convicted sex offender who hanged himself in prison. Her mother abandoned her before she even turned 5. By age 11, Aileen was trading sexual favors at school for cigarettes and food. By 14, she was pregnant after being raped by her grandfather's friend. The baby was put up for adoption. She was thrown out of the house, left to survive on her own in the woods of Michigan, living in abandoned cars and hustling for scraps. That broken childhood forged a woman who trusted no one and learned to weaponize her body. By her 20s, she drifted to Florida, supporting herself as a sex worker. She would stand by the side of highways, offering rides and companionship to men. Most saw her as just another prostitute. None suspected that she was on the path to becoming one of America's most notorious serial killers. Between 1989 and 1990, Aileen Wuornos murdered at least 7 men. Her method was simple but brutal. She would lure them under the guise of sex, then pull out a gun and shoot them point blank. She robbed them, stole their cars, and disappeared into the sprawl of Florida's highways. Each body was found dumped in remote areas, shot multiple times, stripped of valuables, left to rot under the blistering sun. When police finally connected the dots, her explanation was chilling. She didn't deny the killings. Instead, she claimed every one of them had tried to rape her. She insisted she was a victim, not a predator. In her mind, she was fighting back against abusive men, but investigators and prosecutors painted a very different picture. They pointed out the cold efficiency of her crimes, the thefts, the way she repeated the same pattern again and again. To them, it wasn't self-defense, it was calculated murder. What made Wuornos unforgettable wasn't just the killings, but her behavior in court. While most defendants are coached to appear calm, remorseful, or broken, Wuornos did the opposite. She exploded in rage. She screamed at judges. She cursed at juries. She spit venom at the cameras. Her infamous outbursts became in national headlines. At one point, she ranted, "I killed those men in cold blood." The courtroom gasped. Viewers at home saw a woman completely unhinged, seemingly proud of the blood on her hands. But beneath the madness, there was also tragedy. Aileen Wuornos had one meaningful relationship in her life, with a woman named Tyree Moore. The two met in a Daytona gay bar in the mid-1980s and became inseparable. After Wuornos was arrested, investigators offered Moore immunity if she helped. Moore agreed, and under police direction, she made a series of recorded phone calls to Wuornos. On those calls, Aileen confessed to the murders, insisting she alone was responsible and that Moore had nothing to do with it. Those recordings became the cornerstone of the case, and Moore later testified against her in court.
I have to confess myself. Okay, yes. Why the hell did you do this? Why did you do this?
In 1992, Wuornos was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death. Over the next decade, she sat on Florida's death row, where she spiraled deeper into paranoia. She accused prison guards of spitting in her food, claimed the police let her keep killing just to sell her story, and even ranted about sonic pressure weapons being used on her. Her descent into delusion was as infamous as her crimes. On October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. Her final words were bizarre, even poetic. She looked at the witnesses and declared, "I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus. Big mothership and all. I'll be back." Then the chemicals flowed, and she was gone. Her story didn't end with her death. Aileen Wuornos became a cultural icon, the subject of documentaries, books, and even the Oscar-winning film Monster, where Charlize Theron portrayed her in one of Hollywood's most chilling transformations. To this day, her case sparks debate. Was she a monster who preyed on innocent men, or was she a broken woman who lashed out after a lifetime of abuse and exploitation? The truth lies somewhere in the middle. Aileen Wuornos wasn't born a killer. She was forged in an environment of violence, neglect, and betrayal. But when she picked up that gun and pulled the trigger, again and again, she crossed a line that could never be explained away by tragedy. Aileen Wuornos wanted the world to see her as a victim. Instead, history will forever remember her as the female predator who turned Florida's highways into hunting grounds.
It is further ordered that on such scheduled date that you be put to death.
Yes, I intend to complete my legal education and become a lawyer and be a damn good lawyer.
Take care of yourself, young man.
Thank you.
It's a tragedy for this court to see it's such a total waste, I think, of humanity that I've experienced in this court. You're a bright young man. If you'd made a good lawyer, I'd love to have you practice in front of me, but you went another way, partner.
When America thinks of serial killers, one name rises above them all, a name that still sparks fear, fascination, and disgust. Decades later, Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy wasn't a shadowy figure hiding in the dark. He was handsome, well-spoken, and unnervingly charming. He worked in politics, studied law, and even volunteered at a crisis hotline, answering calls from desperate people in need. But behind the smile was a sadistic predator who used charm as bait and violence as his true language. Bundy's killing spree stretched through the 1970s, leaving a trail of blood across at least 7 states. Officially, he confessed to 30 murders, but investigators believe the real number may have been higher, perhaps closer to 100. His victims were almost always young women, often college students. Bundy's signature trick was disarmingly simple. He would wear a fake cast or limp with crutches, pretending to be injured. Then he'd ask for help carrying books, loading items into his car, or walking to safety. Once the woman agreed to help, Bundy would strike, knocking her unconscious with a crowbar or pipe, before binding her, driving her to a secluded area, and unleashing the full brutality of his sadism. But it wasn't just the abductions. Bundy's crimes carried a layer of horror that still shocks the world today. He sexually assaulted his victims before and after death. He returned to crime scenes days later to perform acts of necrophilia with the decomposing bodies. In some cases, he decapitated his victims and kept their skulls as souvenirs. This wasn't just murder, it was domination, ritual, and perversion on a scale so grotesque it made him one of the most infamous killers in human history. Bundy didn't just kill at random, he hunted. In January 1974, he broke into the basement apartment of University of Washington student Joni Lentz, bludgeoned her with a crowbar, and sexually assaulted her with a metal rod. She survived, but the injuries left her with permanent brain damage. Just weeks later, he murdered another student, dumping her body in a remote location. As his hunger for violence grew, Bundy's killings accelerated. In the summer of 1974, in broad daylight, he abducted 2 women within hours of each other from Lake Sammamish State Park. Witnesses remembered seeing a handsome man with his arm in a sling introducing himself as Ted. It was one of the first cracks in his facade, the first time his real name was tied to his crimes. Despite mounting suspicion, Bundy's ability to blend in was terrifying. Friends described him as polite, intelligent, and even boyish. He dated. He smiled for photographs. He charmed professors. He even studied psychology and later enrolled in law school, all while hiding the truth. He was one of the most prolific killers of his era. Bundy's arrest in 1975 for a failed kidnapping marked the beginning of the end. Inside his Volkswagen Beetle, police found handcuffs, ski masks, crowbars, and rope, the tools of a predator. Yet even behind bars, Bundy's story took bizarre turns. He escaped not once, but twice. In 1977, he leapt from a courthouse window in Colorado and vanished for 6 days. Later that year, he squeezed through a hole in the ceiling of his jail cell and walked out of the prison, free again. What followed was Bundy's final and most savage spree. In January 1978, he attacked Florida State University's Chi Omega sorority house. In the dead of night, he bludgeoned and strangled 4 young women, killing 2 and leaving 2 others critically injured. Just weeks later, he abducted and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, a crime so heinous, it sealed his fate in the courtroom. Bundy's trials became media spectacles. Cameras packed courtrooms, and women flocked to watch, some even writing him love letters. The killer's charisma hadn't disappeared. He smiled for reporters, acted as his own attorney, and proposed marriage to a woman on live television during his trial.
Carol, do you want to marry me? And I want to marry you. And I do want to marry you.
But no amount of charm could erase the evidence stacked against him. Witness testimony, forensic proof, and his own arrogance. In 1979, Bundy was sentenced to death for the Chi Omega murders. Later, he received a second death sentence for Kimberly Leach's murder. For a decade, he sat on Florida's death row, taunting investigators with partial confessions. Just days before his execution, he began confessing in detail, admitting to killings in multiple states. He told interviewers he was addicted to pornography, blaming it for fueling his fantasies of violence. Experts and victims' families saw it as one last manipulation, a way for Bundy to dodge full responsibility. On January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. Outside the prison, crowds cheered, chanting, "Burn, Bundy, burn." Vendors sold t-shirts and hot dogs. For many, it was a grotesque but fitting end to a man who had inflicted unimaginable pain. Was he born evil? Or did his abusive childhood, an absent father, a mother who pretended to be his sister, a life of lies, help shape the darkness inside him? No answer will ever justify the horrors he unleashed. Ted Bundy once said, "We serial killers are your sons. We are your husbands. We are everywhere." He wanted the world to know that the face of evil isn't always a stranger in the dark. Sometimes, it's the charming man who smiles back at you.
I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself.
What was he trying to do?
Like he was listening to my heart, because at a point he told me he was going to eat my heart at that point.
I know my time in prison will be terrible.
I don't want to ever see my mother have to go through this again. Never, Jeffrey! Jeffrey! I hate you! Mother... I hate you!
I am prepared for your sentence, which I know will be the maximum. I ask for no consideration.
In the summer of 1991, Milwaukee police entered a small apartment that looked ordinary from the outside. What they found inside was a nightmare so grotesque, it scarred America's memory forever. It wasn't just a crime scene, it was a house of horrors. Inside that apartment lived Jeffrey Dahmer, the man who would become infamous as the Milwaukee Cannibal. Dahmer's crimes went far beyond simple murder. Over the course of 13 years, he lured, drugged, strangled, dismembered, and in some cases ate parts of 17 young men and boys. He photographed their corpses, kept skulls and bones as trophies, and stored body parts in his refrigerator and freezer. In his apartment, detectives found human heads in the fridge, hearts and genitals preserved in jars, and a 57-gallon drum filled with dissolving torsos. How did someone like this exist undetected for so long? To understand Dahmer, we have to rewind to his childhood. Born in 1960 in Bath, Ohio, Dahmer was described as a shy, withdrawn boy. From an early age, he showed an obsession with dead animals, collecting roadkill and dissecting it in his backyard shed. Teachers noticed he was quiet and strange, but few could have predicted the darkness that would follow. His teenage years were marked by isolation and alcoholism. While classmates were planning for college, Dahmer was drinking heavily and fantasizing about control over other men. In 1978, just after high school graduation, Dahmer committed his first murder. He picked up 18-year-old hitchhiker Stephen Hicks, brought him home for drinks, and when Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer bludgeoned him with a dumbbell before strangling him. He crushed the bones and scattered them in the woods behind his house. Hicks vanished, and no one suspected the shy teenager. For nearly a decade, Dahmer kept his urges hidden. He enlisted in the army, only to be discharged for alcohol abuse. He moved back in with his grandmother, who grew suspicious of his late nights and strange behavior. But when she confronted him, Dahmer always had excuses. In 1987, his dark fantasies exploded again. At a Milwaukee hotel, Dahmer murdered Stephen Tuomi. This time, he kept the body for days, experimenting with dismemberment. It was the beginning of his descent into full-blown serial killing. From 1987 to 1991, Dahmer's pace accelerated. He targeted gay bars and bathhouses, offering men drinks, money, or photographs in exchange for company. Once lured back to his apartment, he drugged them, strangled them, and posed their bodies for photographs. But his depravity didn't stop there. He engaged in necrophilia, cannibalism, and chilling attempts at creating zombies by drilling holes in his victims' skulls and pouring acid or boiling water inside while they were still alive. He claimed he wanted them to be submissive, permanent companions. Instead, every attempt ended in death. Dahmer's neighbors often complained about strange smells coming from his apartment. He told them it was spoiled meat or tropical fish that had died. Astonishingly, the police had opportunities to stop him but failed. The most infamous example came in May 1991. A 14-year-old boy, Conoraxin Fesamphone, escaped Dahmer's apartment, half naked, bleeding, and incoherent. Neighbors called police, begging them to help. When officers arrived, Dahmer calmly convinced them that the boy was his 19-year-old lover, and they had simply argued. The police believed him, escorted the boy back into Dahmer's apartment, and left. Hours later, Conorak was dead. Just 2 months later, Dahmer's reign of terror finally ended. On July 22nd, 1991, Tracy Edwards, another intended victim, managed to escape. He fled the apartment with one wrist still in handcuffs and flagged down police. When officers entered Dahmer's home, the smell hit them first. Then came the photographs of mutilated bodies. Finally, they opened the fridge and found a human head staring back at them. It was one of the most shocking discoveries in modern crime history. Dahmer was arrested and quickly confessed. He spoke with chilling calmness, admitting to all 17 murders and describing them in detail. He told investigators he had eaten parts of his victims to become part of them. He admitted he kept skulls and skeletons for comfort. He even revealed that he fantasized about building a private altar made of bones, complete with candles and photographs, where he could sit and reflect on his killings. His trial in 1992 was a media circus. Families of the victims sat in horror as Dahmer's gruesome acts were laid bare. The defense argued insanity, pointing to the grotesque nature of his crimes as proof that no sane man could do such things. But the jury didn't buy it. They found Dahmer legally sane and guilty on 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, nearly 1,000 years in prison. But prison wouldn't be his end. On November 28, 1994, after just 2 years behind bars, Dahmer was beaten to death by another inmate, Christopher Scarver, in a Wisconsin prison bathroom. Scarver later said he killed Dahmer because of his crimes and because Dahmer mocked other inmates by shaping food into body parts. Even in death, Dahmer remains one of the most infamous names in crime history. Dahmer himself once said, "It's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. When you depersonalize another person and view them as an object for pleasure instead of a living, breathing human being, it seems to make it easier to do things you shouldn't do." The Milwaukee cannibal remains a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes, it lives in an ordinary apartment on an ordinary street, while the neighbors go about their lives completely unaware that a monster lives next door.
It looked like it was a body, and it had no hand on it.
In 2009, Cleveland police entered a modest house on Imperial Avenue. What they uncovered inside shocked not just the city, but the entire nation. The home didn't just smell bad, it reeked of death. Hidden in crawl spaces, shallow graves, and even the backyard were the decomposing remains of women. 11 victims in total, and the man responsible was Anthony Soule, a convicted rapist who had been hiding in plain sight. Anthony Soule's childhood was a study in cruelty, breeding cruelty. Born in 1959, he grew up in a home ruled by abuse. His mother was violent, beating the children with extension cords and forcing them into bizarre punishments. Soule later admitted that he carried that rage with him into adulthood. By the time he was a young man, he had already begun his descent into violence. In 1989, Soule committed a brutal rape. He lured a woman into his home, bound her with a tie, and assaulted her for hours. He was convicted and served 15 years in prison. That conviction should have been enough to mark him as a danger forever. But in 2005, he was released back into society. He moved into his stepmother's house on Imperial Avenue. That house would become his killing ground. Neighbors noticed strange things almost immediately. The smell. At first, people thought it was rotten meat from a nearby sausage factory. Others assumed it was sewer problems. The odor was so overwhelming that local residents filed complaints, but city officials shrugged it off. What no one realized was that the stench was coming from Soule's victims, decomposing inside the walls and basement. Soule's method was horrifyingly consistent. He targeted women who were vulnerable, many struggling with addiction or homelessness. He invited them into his home, offering food, alcohol, or a place to sleep. Once inside, he turned predator. He strangled them, sometimes with a cord, sometimes with his bare hands. Then, he hid their bodies throughout the property. Some he buried in shallow graves in the backyard. Others he left in crawl spaces or covered with blankets in upstairs rooms. For years, the House of Horror stood just a few feet from families going about their daily lives. The victims disappeared one by one. Their families filed missing persons reports, but many went unnoticed by authorities. Because the women were poor, black, and struggling with addiction, their disappearances weren't treated with urgency. That indifference allowed Soule to keep killing, his crimes hidden in plain sight. Everything changed in September 2009. A woman named Latundra Billups accused Soule of luring her into his house, attempting to strangle her and raping her. She escaped and went straight to the police. With her report, officers obtained a search warrant. On October 29th, they entered the Imperial Avenue home. What they found was a nightmare. The smell of rotting flesh was overpowering. Investigators first found remains in the basement and the backyard. As they searched further, more bodies were uncovered in crawl spaces. and hidden throughout the house. In total, the remains of 11 women were recovered. Some had been dead for years. Their names included women like Crystal Dozier, Tonya Carmichael, and Talacia Fortson. Lives cut short, their stories erased until investigators pieced them together. The house itself was grotesque. Flies swarmed through the rooms. Stains in bodily fluids marked the floors. Some bodies were so badly decomposed that identification took months. Forensic experts had to rely on DNA and dental records to give the victims their names back. When Soule was arrested, his reaction was chilling. He showed no remorse. He claimed he didn't remember killing so many women. He suggested that drugs and alcohol clouded his memory. But prosecutors painted a different picture. This wasn't about blackout violence. It was cold, methodical murder. Soule lowered his victims, controlled them, and disposed of them like garbage. The trial in 2011 was one of the most disturbing in Ohio's history. Family members of the victims filled the courtroom, clutching photographs of their lost daughters, sisters, and mothers. Prosecutors presented gruesome evidence, photographs of the remains, testimony from survivors who had barely escaped, and details of the horrid smell that had plagued the neighborhood for years. The defense argued that Soule had brain damage from a childhood head injury and years of alcohol abuse. They pleaded for mercy, suggesting life in prison instead of death, but the jury wasn't swayed. After weeks of testimony, they convicted Anthony Soule on 82 charges, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, and rape. The jury recommended the death penalty. On August 12, 2011, Soule was formally sentenced to die. He was sent to death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. There, he remained for a decade. In February 2021, before his execution date arrived, Anthony Soule died of a terminal illness. He never faced the needle, but he spent his final years confined in a cell, a shell of the predator he once was. The story of Anthony Soule raises brutal questions. How did the system fail for so long? Neighbors complained for years about the smell. Families begged police to search for missing women. Yet because the victims came from marginalized communities, their lives were treated as disposable. Soule took advantage of that indifference, confident that no one would look too closely. One of the most haunting aspects of the case is the house itself. After the investigation, the city demolished it in 2011. For residents of Cleveland, it wasn't just a house, it was a wound on the community, a reminder of how horror can hide behind ordinary walls. Today, the lot where it once stood is empty, but its memory is a scar that will never fully fade.
She fighting for her life, fighting for my pleasure.
When most people think of America's most infamous killers, names like Bundy and Dahmer come to mind. But in 2018, the FBI made a chilling announcement. The deadliest serial killer in US history was not a household name at all. His name was Samuel Little, and for decades, he hunted in the shadows, leaving a staggering body count behind him. Authorities confirmed Little was responsible for at least 93 murders, nearly all women. For years, he drifted across the country like a ghost, strangling his victims, dumping their bodies, and moving on before anyone realized what had happened. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't famous, and that's exactly why he got away with it for so long. Samuel Little was born in 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia. His childhood was shaped by instability. Raised mostly by his grandmother, he struggled in school, bounced between relatives, and began a life of crime early. By his teens, he was stealing cars, breaking into houses, and skipping classes to watch violent boxing matches. He dropped out of high school and was in and out of juvenile detention centers. Violence and transience became the fabric of his life. In the 1960s, Little's crimes escalated. He was arrested for robbery, assault, and drug-related offenses. But his true obsession wasn't theft, it was domination. He developed a method so consistent that it became his trademark. He targeted women on the margins of society, sex workers, drug users, women living in poverty. He chose them not only because they were vulnerable, but because he knew law enforcement would treat their disappearances as low priority. Once he lured a woman, Little's attack was quick and brutal. He strangled his victims with his bare hands, sometimes using a rope or belt. Strangulation was his signature because it gave him complete control, allowing him to watch the life drain from his victims. He later told investigators it gave him a sexual release. Because strangulation often leaves few obvious marks, coroners frequently ruled his murders as overdoses, accidents, or natural causes. That forensic blind spot allowed him to escape suspicion for decades. Little lived like a drifter, moving from state to state, city to city, leaving bodies scattered across the map. He killed in Florida, Texas, Ohio, California, Louisiana, and beyond. Police departments across the country never connected the dots. To them, each woman's death looked isolated, a tragic but unremarkable statistic. The law finally caught up with him in 2012, but not because of murder. Police in Kentucky arrested him on a drug charge and extradited him to California for outstanding warrants. In Los Angeles, DNA evidence linked him to the unsolved murders of 3 women from the late 1980s. All 3 had been strangled. Suddenly, Samuel Little wasn't just another career criminal. He was facing murder charges. At his 2014 trial, prosecutors laid out the gruesome details. The victims, Carol Elford, Guadalupe Apodaca, and Audrey Nelson, had been strangled and dumped in alleyways. For decades, their families had no answers. Now, DNA tied them to Little. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. For most killers, that would be the end of a story. But for Samuel Little, prison was just the beginning of the revelations. In 2018, Texas Rangers James Holland visited Little in prison, hoping to extract more confessions. What he uncovered was staggering. Little began to talk, slowly at first, then in torrents of detail. He admitted to dozens of murders across the country, describing the women, the cities, the circumstances. He wasn't guessing or bluffing. His memory was photographic. Little even sketched his victims from memory, producing haunting portraits of women long forgotten by police files. Investigators compared his drawings with cold cases and found match after match. The FBI launched a nationwide effort to verify his confessions. Over time, they confirmed at least 60 of the murders, with Little suspected in more than 30 others. That made him the most prolific serial killer in American history. The scope of his crimes is almost impossible to fathom. For over 4 decades, Samuel Little preyed on women in at least 19 states. Many of his victims remain unidentified, their stories erased by time and indifference. He was the ultimate predator, hidden in plain sight, killing quietly and moving on. What made Little especially terrifying was his lack of remorse. In interviews, he chuckled as he described the killings, recalling how some victims fought back, how their eyes looked in their final moments. He referred to the murders as if they were personal trophies. One investigator later said, "It was like talking to pure evil, but wrapped in the body of an old man." Samuel Little died in December 2020 at the age of 80, serving his life sentences in a California prison. He never faced trial for most of his crimes. The FBI's acknowledgement of Little as America's most prolific killer forces us to confront a painful truth. Many of his victims were ignored because of who they were. They were poor, addicted, or involved in sex work. Society looked away, and Samuel Little exploited that indifference. Today, the FBI still maintains a website featuring his drawings, urging the public to help identify more of his victims. Each portrait is a reminder that behind the statistics were real women with names, families, and lives. Women who vanished into the night and whose deaths were written off until Little decided to boast about them.
Stupid, clumsy, slow, sloppy, weak, dirty. If you hadn't attacked them in their sleep, in the middle of the night, like a pedophile, Kaylee would have kicked your ass.
You're evil. There's no place for you in heaven. You are gonna suffer, man. I'm shaking because I want to reach out to you, but I hope you feel my energy, okay? Go to hell.
In November 2022, America woke up to one of the most chilling crime stories in recent memory. 4 college students, Ethan Chapin, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernadol, and Kaylee Gonçalves, were found brutally stabbed to death inside their off-campus house in Moscow, Idaho. The murders shocked the nation, not just because of their brutality, but because of where they happened. A quiet college town, the kind of place people thought was safe. For months, the case consumed headlines, social media, and late-night speculation. And at the center of it all was an unlikely suspect, Bryan Kohberger, a criminology PhD student who studied the psychology of killers while allegedly becoming one himself. The attack happened in the early hours of November 13th, 2022. Investigators believe Kohberger crept into the house wearing all black, armed with a large knife. He moved room to room, killing with surgical precision. The coroner described the scene as one of the most gruesome she had ever witnessed. The students had been attacked while they slept or tried to fight back, leaving behind signs of a chaotic struggle. 2 roommates survived, one of whom saw a masked man walking out of the house that night. For weeks, the murders terrified the community. Students fled campus, afraid the killer might strike again. Police released little information, fueling online theories that ranged from drug deals to targeted revenge. The case dominated true crime podcasts, TikTok breakdowns, and cable news panels. Everyone wanted to know who could commit such a brutal act and why. The answer came 6 weeks later, on December 30th, 2022. Police arrested 28-year-old Bryan Kohberger at his parents' home in Pennsylvania. The suspect wasn't a drifter or an outsider. He was a criminology student at Washington State University, just a short drive across the border from Moscow, Idaho. He had studied criminal behavior, profiling, and forensic psychology. Ironically, the very tools that investigators used to catch him. The evidence against him was damning. Detectives found his DNA on a knife sheath left on one of the victim's beds. Surveillance cameras captured his white hind eye, circling the neighborhood on the night of the murders. Phone records placed him near the crime scene multiple times in the weeks leading up to the killings, suggesting he had stalked the victims. The details were chilling. Investigators alleged that Kohberger had followed some of the victims on social media. He left his cell phone turned off during the hours of the murders, only to turn it back on as he drove home, an attempt to avoid detection that instead highlighted his movements. Even more disturbing, after the murders, he allegedly returned to the crime scene in the days that followed, driving past the house as though reliving what he had done. When news of his arrest broke, shockwaves rippled through the nation. How could a man who studied criminology, a man who should have understood law enforcement tactics, commit such a crime and think he could get away with it? Former classmates described Kohberger as awkward, controlling, and intensely critical. Some recalled how he would dominate classroom discussions, lecturing others on the minds of killers. Others noticed his obsession with fitness, diet, and control. He wasn't charismatic like Bundy, but there was a quiet arrogance about him. The trial became one of the most anticipated in years. Courtrooms filled with journalists, true crime bloggers, and grieving families. The proceedings were delayed multiple times, adding to the tension. Finally, in July 2025, Bryan Kohberger entered a plea agreement. He admitted to the murders of all 4 students, receiving 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. By pleading guilty, he avoided the death penalty, sparking fierce debate across the country. For many, the outcome felt unsatisfying. 4 young lives had been cut short in the most violent way imaginable. Yet the killer would live out his life behind bars. Kaylee Gonçalves' family openly criticized the deal, calling it a betrayal of justice. Others argued that avoiding a lengthy death penalty trial spared the families more trauma. Either way, the case left scars that will never heal. The murders also forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about crime in America. These were not women lured off the streets, not victims of gang violence or random chance. They were college students in their own home, asleep in what should have been the safest place in the world. Their deaths shattered the illusion of safety that many young people carry when leaving home for school. In the end, Bryan Kohberger will never walk free again. He will spend the rest of his life in a cell, stripped of the control he once craved. But the questions he leaves behind are chilling. Why did he do it? What was his motive? Was it a fantasy, a test of his own intelligence, or pure sadism? We may never fully know. What we do know is this. On one cold November night in Idaho, 4 young lives were stolen by a man who thought he was smarter than everyone else. A man who believed he could study the rules, break them, and walk away untouched. He was wrong, and the world will never forget his name.
Entertain the children there. And we didn't entertain them with handcuffs or anything like that. All we used,
Few figures in the history of American crime blur the line between ordinary neighbor and monstrous killer more than John Wayne Gacy. To the outside world, he was a business owner, a Democrat precinct captain, and even a volunteer clown who entertained children at charity events. But beneath that smiling face was something far darker. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy raped, tortured, and murdered at least 33 teenage boys and young men. He buried most of them under his own home. He became known as the Killer Clown, a name that still sends shivers down spines today. Gacy's early life showed signs of the darkness to come. Born in Chicago in 1942, he grew up under the shadow of an abusive alcoholic father. His father mocked him as weak, while his mother tried to shield him. As he got older, Gacy developed health problems, fainting spells, and struggles with his sexuality. He desperately craved approval and respect. That hunger for control and acceptance would later twist into violence. By his 20s, Gacy seemed like a man building a normal life. He married, had children, and became active in his community. He ran a small contracting company, PDM Contractors, and earned a reputation as hard-working. But beneath the mask of success, he carried disturbing secrets. In 1968, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy in Iowa. He served less than 2 years in prison before being released. The conviction should have branded him as a danger forever, but instead, Gacy returned to Chicago, where he rebuilt his image and resumed his life. During the 1970s, Gacy cultivated an appearance of respectability. He threw neighborhood parties, rubbed elbows with politicians, and even dressed up as Pogo the Clown to perform at children's hospitals and fundraisers. But behind closed doors, he was luring young men, often runaways or boys looking for work, into his home under the pretense of job offers or friendship. Once inside, Gacy used a sinister trick. He would convince his victims to try on handcuffs, calling it a magic trick. Once restrained, the laughter turned to horror. Gacy would then assault, strangle, and sometimes torture them for hours. Many victims were buried in the crawl space beneath his house. The stench of decay eventually became so strong that neighbors complained, but Gacy always had excuses. For years, he evaded suspicion. Police often dismissed missing boys as runaways. Families begged for answers, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. Gacy thrived in that indifference. By the time authorities finally took him seriously, dozens of boys were already dead. The unraveling of Gacy's double life began in December 1978, when 15-year-old Robert Piest vanished after telling his mother he was going to speak with Gacy about a construction job. Police obtained a search warrant for Gacy's home. What they discovered was horrifying. Investigators found a crawl space filled with bodies. One by one, they unearthed the remains of 29 young men buried under the house. 4 others were found in nearby rivers. The sheer scale of the killing shocked even veteran detectives. Gacy's arrest revealed the extent of his monstrous double life. He had been murdering for years, while simultaneously entertaining children as a clown and shaking hands with politicians. The contrast was so grotesque that his story became a media frenzy. Reporters dubbed him the killer clown, cementing his place in true crime infamy. At his 1980 trial, prosecutors laid out the gruesome evidence. Survivors testified about Gacy's violent sexual assaults. Families of the missing listened in horror as police described pulling bones from his cruel space. Gacy, for his part, claimed insanity, suggesting that Jack, an alternate personality, had committed the murders. The jury didn't believe it. They convicted him on 33 counts of murder, the most for any one person in U.S. history at that time. He was sentenced to death. For 14 years, Gacy sat on Illinois' death row, painting portraits of clowns that later sold for thousands of dollars to morbid collectors. He gave interviews, alternating between denial, blame-shifting, and arrogant justifications. In one infamous interview, he declared, "I should never have been convicted of anything more serious than running a cemetery without a license." On May 10th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Crowds gathered outside the prison, some holding signs, others cheering. After his death, his brain was removed for study, in hopes of finding a biological cause for his depravity. Nothing definitive was ever discovered. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy is one of horror wrapped in ordinary disguise. He wasn't a drifter or an outcast. He was the man next door, the neighbor who waved while mowing the lawn, the clown who made balloon animals for children. Today, the lot where Gacy's house once stood is empty. The crawl space that held dozens of bodies is gone, replaced by grass and silence. But the memory lingers. Every time people hear about a friendly face hiding a monstrous secret, Gacy's shadow looms in the background.
I think most humans have in them the capacity to commit murder. It is not because...
No, we don't, Richard.
They choose not to, not because they are morally superior, as they so commonly claim, but because they are imprisoned in a web of responsibilities, commitments, beliefs, and sentiments, and that would render murder an absurd gamble or ridiculous self-destruction.
In the mid-1980s, California was gripped by terror. Doors were locked, windows nailed shut, and people slept with lights on, terrified of the man prowling their neighborhoods at night. He was called the Night Stalker, his real name, Richard Ramirez, a self-proclaimed Satanist, rapist, and murderer whose random sadistic attacks made him one of the most feared killers in American history. Ramirez wasn't just brutal, he was unpredictable. He targeted men, women, and even children, with no consistent pattern. He raped, tortured, and murdered at will. He broke into homes at night, using the cover of darkness as his camouflage. Sometimes he used a gun, other times a knife, a cord, or even a hammer. His randomness created a wave of paranoia across Southern California. No one knew who would be next. Born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas, Ramirez's early life foreshadowed the monster he would become. He grew up in poverty, exposed to violence from a young age. His father was abusive, and by his teens, Ramirez was heavily into drugs. But one of the most disturbing influences came from his cousin, Miguel, a Vietnam veteran. Miguel would show young Richard photos of Vietnamese women he had raped and killed during the war. He even bragged about decapitations and mutilations. When Ramirez was just 13, he witnessed Miguel shoot his wife in the face during a domestic argument. That moment cemented violence in his psyche. By his 20s, Ramirez had moved to California and was fully immersed in drugs, theft, and Satanism. He believed the devil guided him, and he incorporated satanic rituals into his crimes. Victims reported him forcing them to swear to Satan as he assaulted them. He left pentagrams at crime scenes, drawn in lipstick, or scratched into walls. For him, murder was both a thrill and a ritual. Between 1984 and 1985, Ramirez unleashed a spree of terror. In June 1984, he murdered 79-year-old Jenny Vincow in her home, stabbing her repeatedly and slashing her throat. Over the next year, he struck again and again. In March 1985, he shot and killed a man before assaulting the man's wife. Weeks later, he broke into another home, shooting a 64-year-old man and raping his wife. The violence escalated. He mutilated victims, kidnapped children, and committed acts of unspeakable cruelty. Unlike many killers, Ramirez thrived on chaos. He didn't care if people were awake. He didn't care if there were multiple victims. He wanted to spread fear. Police were baffled by his lack of a consistent method. At times, he wore gloves and left no prints. Other times, he left behind shoe impressions, one of which investigators eventually traced to an Avia sneaker, a key piece of evidence that would later link him to multiple crime scenes. By the summer of 1985, the Night Stalker had become a household name. Newspapers ran terrifying headlines. Families huddled in fear. Gun sales skyrocketed across Los Angeles. Residents formed neighborhood watch patrols, determined to protect themselves from the faceless intruder. But Ramirez wasn't invincible. In August 1985, a turning point came. He abducted 2 young sisters, assaulted them, and released them. Investigators finally got a solid fingerprint from a stolen car he had abandoned. It matched Richard Ramirez, a drifter with a long rap sheet of burglary and drug charges. Authorities released his mugshot to the media. The Night Stalker suddenly had a face. Days later, Ramirez was spotted in East Los Angeles. When residents recognized him from the newspapers, he tried to flee, but this time, the community turned on him. Locals chased him through the streets, beating him with pipes and holding him down until police arrived. The city that had lived in fear had captured its monster. His trial in 1989 was as disturbing as his crimes. Ramirez showed no remorse. He smirked in court, flashed a pentagram carved into his hand, and shouted. He soaked up the media attention, becoming a twisted celebrity. Women wrote him love letters, sending nude photos and declaring their devotion. The phenomenon of killer groupies reached a disturbing peak with Ramirez, who became a cult-like figure to some, despite his atrocities. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Fingerprints, eyewitnesses, ballistic tests, and stolen property from victims found in his possession. He was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The jury sentenced him to death. Even then, Ramirez remained defiant. He told reporters, "Big deal. Death always comes with the territory. See you in Disneyland."
Big deal. Death always went with the territory. I'll see you in Disneyland.
He was sent to California's death row at San Quentin, where he would spend the rest of his life. Richard Ramirez died in 2013 of cancer, long before his execution date arrived. For nearly 3 decades, he lived in prison as one of America's most notorious killers. His legacy is pure terror.
Why did you kill those people?
No comments.
Ramirez didn't have a single type of victim. He didn't follow a predictable pattern. He was random, chaotic, and fueled by evil ideology. That's what made him so terrifying. You couldn't prepare for him. You couldn't predict him. You could only hope he didn't choose your home. The Night Stalker taught California a brutal lesson. Sometimes evil doesn't hide. It kicks down the door in the middle of the night.
Поднимайте подсудимого. Чикатило, по приговору суда вы приговорены к смертной казни. Вам ясен приговор суда? Ясен. Уводите.
In the crumbling Soviet Union of the 1970s and 1980s, a killer stalked the countryside, preying on women and children with unimaginable brutality. His crimes were so horrific, so grotesque, that even hardened investigators struggled to comprehend them. His name was Andrei Chikatilo, but the world came to know him as the Butcher of Rostov. For over a decade, Chikatilo terrorized the Soviet Union, killing at least 52 people, though some estimates place the number higher. His victims were often school children, runaways, or vulnerable women, lured to remote areas with promises of food, work, or shelter. Once alone, he unleashed violence that defied human comprehension. He stabbed, slashed, mutilated, and in many cases, cannibalized parts of his victims. The brutality was staggering. Chikatilo was born in 1936 in Ukraine under Stalin's oppressive rule. His childhood was marked by famine, poverty, and humiliation. Neighbors whispered that his older brother had been kidnapped and eaten during the Holodomor, a trauma that haunted the family. His father was captured during World War II, leaving Andrei to grow up under the harsh control of his mother. He struggled with chronic impotence, a condition that filled him with shame and rage. These frustrations, combined with a deep sense of inadequacy, festered inside him for decades. On the surface, Chikatilo appeared unremarkable. He studied, married, and became a father of 2 children. He worked as a school teacher and later as a clerk. But beneath the facade of normalcy, his urges grew darker. He began exposing himself to children, groping students, and indulging in violent fantasies. Early arrests for sexual misconduct were often dismissed by Soviet authorities, who treated such crimes as minor or embarrassing. That failure to act allowed him to escalate. His first known murder came in 1978. He lured 9-year-old Yelena Zakatovna to a shed, attempted to rape her, and when he couldn't perform sexually, he stabbed her repeatedly in frustration. She died in a frenzy of blood. To cover up the crime, he threw her body into a river. Another man was wrongfully convicted and executed for the crime, allowing Chikatilo to continue killing unchecked. Throughout the 1980s, the body count rose. Victims ranged from young boys to teenage girls to grown women. He would lure them near bus or train stations, promising food or assistance. Once secluded, he stabbed them dozens of times, often targeting the eyes, chest, and abdomen. Many were found with mutilations so severe they were unrecognizable. In some cases, organs were removed. Investigators later said it looked less like murder and more like butchery. The Soviet system made catching him even harder. The government was reluctant to admit a serial killer was on the loose, fearing it would expose weakness and panic the public. Investigators were pressured to close cases quickly, sometimes charging innocent men to maintain the illusion of order. Meanwhile, Chikatilo kept hunting, confident that the bureaucracy would protect him. By the late 1980s, however, the pattern was undeniable. Bodies were being found across Rostov Oblast, near rail lines and forests. A task force was assembled, led by Detective Mikhail Fetisov. They called the case Forest Strip. For years, they hunted the phantom killer, but without DNA technology and with limited resources, the search dragged on. The breakthrough came in 1990. Undercover officers spotted Chikatilo behaving suspiciously near a train station, approaching young women and children. They detained him and found incriminating evidence: a knife, rope, and stains on his clothing. When they searched his home, they uncovered more: his diaries, filled with notes of his crimes. At first, Chikatilo denied everything, but after days of interrogation, he broke. In chilling detail, he confessed to dozens of murders, describing each attack with unnerving precision. He admitted that the killings gave him sexual satisfaction, explaining that stabbing and mutilating victims compensated for his impotence. His lack of remorse stunned investigators. Chikatilo's 1992 trial became a spectacle. Behind the glass of a reinforced cage, he ranted, shouted, and exposed himself in court. Families of the victims screamed and cursed him as prosecutors described the horrors he inflicted. The press dubbed him the Red Ripper, comparing him to Jack the Ripper. The evidence was overwhelming: Eyewitnesses, confessions, and physical evidence tied him to the crimes. The jury found him guilty of 52 murders. Judge Leonid Akubzanov famously told him, "This monster is not a man. He deserves to be executed." The courtroom erupted in applause. On February 14th, 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head in a Russian prison. There were no tears, no sympathy, only relief that one of the worst killers in history was finally gone. For years, innocent men were arrested and in at least one case executed, while the real killer continued his spree. His story is not only about a monster, it's about how bureaucracy and denial allowed him to flourish. The Butcher of Rostov remains one of the most infamous killers in history. His name is a reminder of what happens when society ignores its most vulnerable and when authorities refuse to confront the truth.
O meu pai matou minha mãe por quê? E minha mãe tinha traído ele. Mentira, minha mãe era daqui do Brasil, lá fora os vizinhos recolheram. Mas ele ia matar todo mundo, pra matar na cadeia, não foi na rua, tava preso já. Eu fiquei 42 anos preso.
In Brazil, crime is no stranger to the streets. But in the middle of the chaos, one man stood out, not for protecting people, not for building a life, but for killing. His name was Pedro Rodrigues Filho. The world came to know him as Pedrinho Matador, which means Little Pedro the Killer. He murdered over 70 people, maybe more. He claimed he only killed the guilty, rapists, murderers, abusers. But what he called justice was really an obsession with blood. Pedro's story began in horror. Born in 1954, he grew up in a violent home. His father was abusive, his family poor, and his childhood walked by brutality. When Pedro was still in the womb, his father kicked his pregnant mother so hard she suffered a permanent injury. That abuse marked him before he was even born. By the time Pedro was a teenager, his life was already spinning toward violence. At 14, he committed his first murder. The deputy mayor of his town had fired Pedro's father, accusing him of stealing food from a school kitchen. Pedro believed his father was innocent, so he decided the deputy mayor deserved to die. He stole a shotgun, waited outside City Hall, and shot him in cold blood. Hours later, he tracked down the man he believed had really done the stealing and killed him too. That day, Pedro became a killer, and he never looked back. By 18, he was already known as a dangerous figure. He moved to Sao Paulo, where he fell in love with a woman named Maria Olympia. For a brief moment, he tasted something normal: love, stability, even the possibility of a family. But when Maria was murdered by criminals, Pedro's response was the only one he knew: revenge. He hunted down her killers and executed them one by one. From then on, killing wasn't just something he did, it was the center of his life. In 1973, police finally arrested him, but prison didn't stop Pedro. It gave him more victims. Behind bars, he claimed to be a vigilante. He killed rapists, gang members, and anyone he decided was evil. Some inmates were stabbed dozens of times. Others were strangled or slashed to pieces. Pedro even bragged about carving the words, "I kill for pleasure," into one man's chest. He wasn't just punishing criminals, he was enjoying it. The most shocking act of his prison years wasn't against strangers, it was against his own father. While locked up, Pedro learned that his father had murdered his mother with a machete. Pedro swore revenge. During a prison visit, he ambushed his father, stabbing him 22 times before cutting out a piece of his heart. He put it in his mouth, chewed, and spat it on the ground. Even by prison standards, it was an act so brutal it became legend. By the time courts tallied up his crimes, Pedro Rodrigues Filho had been convicted of 71 murders. Some investigators believed he killed over 100. His sentences added up to more than 400 years in prison. But Brazil's law at the time capped sentences at 30 years. In 2007, after serving 34 years, Pedro walked out of prison a free man. Most killers disappear into obscurity. Pedro did the opposite. He embraced his fame. He started a YouTube channel where he told stories of his past, commented on crime, and even claimed he was reformed. His channel grew, attracting thousands of subscribers. Viewers couldn't believe what they were watching. A serial killer lecturing about morality. Some saw it as darkly fascinating. Others saw it as offensive. A murderer turning his crimes into entertainment. But Pedro couldn't escape his past. In March 2023, outside his home in Morgue das Cruzes, Sao Paulo, gunmen ambushed him. He was shot multiple times in broad daylight and died instantly. The man who had once killed with impunity was now just another victim of Brazil's endless cycle of violence. His murder remains unsolved. Some believe it was revenge from families of his victims. Others think organized criminals wanted him silenced. But the truth is, Pedro lived by the blade, and he died by it. Pedro's life forces an uncomfortable question. Was he really a vigilante who punished the guilty? Or was that just his excuse? To the families of his victims, it doesn't matter. Whether his targets were rapists or rivals, he left behind destruction. His final legacy is a warning. Violence never cancels violence. It only multiplies it. Pedro left Brazil with more blood, more pain, and more victims than anyone can count. These 10 names remind us that monsters don't just live in horror stories. They walk among us. They smile. They shake hands. They go to school. They raise families. And behind that mask, they destroy lives. From Bundy's charm, to Dahmer's fridge of horrors, to Pedro's twisted code of vigilante justice, these cases reveal the darkest depths of human cruelty. They are a haunting reminder that the most devastating evil can sometimes come from the people who seem the most ordinary. If you found this exploration into these shocking cases compelling, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Which of these killers do you think was the most disturbing? Share your thoughts in the comments below.